"Sir, I need you to step out of that chair right now." Officer Ryan Castellanos' voice carried across the grocery store parking lot with practiced authority. His hand rested on his duty belt, body camera activated and recording from his chest, as he approached the man sitting in a motorized wheelchair near the entrance of Morrison's Market. "Excuse me?" Michael Torres looked up from his phone, confusion crossing his face. "Officer, I'm just waiting for my wife. She's inside shopping. I don't care what you're doing." Castellanos stepped closer, his body camera capturing Torres in the frame, a Latino man in his early 40s wearing a polo shirt and khakis, his motorized wheelchair clearly visible with medical equipment attached. "You're loitering. I've had complaints. You need to move along." Torres's hands tightened on his wheelchair controls. "Officer, I'm disabled. I can't just stand up and walk away. My wife has our van keys. I'm waiting right here like I always do." What Castellano didn't know as he stared down at Torres with barely concealed contempt was that Michael Torres was a decorated Iraq War veteran, paralyzed from the waist down after an IED explosion in Fallujah took his ability to walk, but not his dignity. He didn't know that Torres held 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He didn't know that the medical equipment on the wheelchair included a catheter bag and spinal support system documenting permanent paralysis. And Castellanos certainly didn't know that his body camera was recording every word, every gesture, every moment of what was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career and the Riverside Police Department's history. I've heard that before. Castellanos' camera captured his dismissive hand wave. People fake disabilities all the time to get sympathy, to get benefits they don't deserve. Stand up and show me you can't walk, or I'm going to assume you're scamming. Torres felt humiliation burning in his chest, the familiar sting of being questioned about his disability by someone who refused to believe the evidence in front of them. "Officer Castellano," he said, reading the nameplate clearly visible on the camera footage. "I physically cannot stand. I was injured in combat. I have full VA documentation. My wheelchair is motorized because I have no function below my waist." Castellanos' jaw tightened, captured in profile as he moved around the wheelchair, his camera recording multiple angles of Torres and the medical equipment. "Yeah, well, I need to verify that. You got paperwork on you proving you're really disabled? My medical records are private." Torres's voice remained steady, despite his racing heart. "I don't have to prove my disability to you. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm sitting in a public parking lot waiting for my wife. That's where you're wrong." Castellano leaned down, his face filling more of the camera frame as he got closer to Torres. "This is private property. The store owner has the right to have people removed, and you're refusing a lawful order from a police officer." Around them, other shoppers had begun to notice the confrontation. A woman with a shopping cart slowed, watching with concern. A teenage employee gathering carts pulled out his phone. An elderly man near the entrance stopped to observe, his expression troubled. What none of them knew yet was that Castellanos' own body camera was capturing everything in high-definition clarity, documenting the beginning of an incident that would expose years of discrimination and cost the city nearly $20 million. Torres's wife, Carmen, emerged from the store carrying grocery bags, her smile fading instantly when she saw the officer confronting her husband. "Officer, what's going on?" She set down the bags, moving quickly toward them. "Ma'am, stay back." Castellanos' camera swiveled to capture Carmen, a woman in her late 30s wearing scrubs from her shift as an ICU nurse. "This doesn't concern you. That's my husband." Carmen's voice rose, medical training helping her stay composed despite her fear. "What's happening?" "Your husband is refusing to comply with a lawful order." Castellanos' camera recorded his own aggressive stance, positioned between Carmen and Torres. He needs to prove he's actually disabled or move along. "Prove he's disabled?" Carmen's voice cracked with disbelief. "Officer, he's in a wheelchair. He's paralyzed. What more proof do you need?" Castellanos' body camera captured him grabbing the handles of Torres's wheelchair, the sudden movement making Torres flinch. "If he can't stand up and prove it, I'm going to help him out of that chair myself." "Officer, please don't." Torres's hands gripped his armrests, panic flooding through him. "You're going to hurt me. I'm telling you the truth about my condition." What Officer Ryan Castellano didn't know, as his hands tightened on the wheelchair handles, as his body camera recorded every second from his own perspective, was that Michael Torres's combat-related Paralysis was 100% permanent and fully documented by the Department of Veterans Affairs. He didn't know that Carmen Torres was already pulling out her phone to record from a different angle. He didn't know that the teenage employee's video was already being live-streamed to hundreds of viewers. And Castellanos certainly didn't know that buried in his personnel file were 19 complaints over 7 years, each one describing the exact same pattern of behavior he was displaying now. Aggressive confrontation of minorities, refusal to believe legitimate explanations, escalation to physical force when challenged. This confrontation was about to rip all those buried secrets into daylight and cost Riverside a price that would make national headlines and force a reckoning the department had avoided for nearly a decade. "Sir, last warning." Castellanos' voice was captured clearly on his body camera audio. "Stand up or I'm removing you from this chair by force. I can't stand." Torres's voice broke. "Please, officer, I'm a veteran. I served this country. Don't do this." Castellano pulled backward on the wheelchair handles, tilting it at a dangerous angle, and Michael Torres's world turned upside down. Officer Ryan Castellano didn't just threaten to remove Michael Torres from his wheelchair. He actually did it. With one sharp backward pull and a sideways shove, Castellano sent Torres crashing onto the asphalt parking lot of Morrison's Market, while at least 12 people watched in absolute horror. His body camera captured the entire sequence from his perspective, the view tilting as he manipulated the wheelchair, then steadying as Torres hit the ground with a sickening impact that made several witnesses gasp audibly. Torres landed hard on his right side, his body folding awkwardly because paralyzed legs don't brace for impact. The sound of his shoulder striking pavement was picked up clearly on Castellanos' body camera microphone. His phone skittered across the asphalt. His catheter bag, attached to his wheelchair, was torn loose, the medical equipment scattering. Torres lay there on the hot parking lot surface, stunned and helpless, unable to push himself up or even adjust his position, because that's what paralysis means. When you hit the ground, you stay there until someone helps you. His body camera perspective showed Castellano standing over him, breathing hard, while Torres struggled just to turn his head. Carmen's scream cut through everything. The body camera captured her rushing into frame, dropping to her knees beside her husband. "What did you do? What did you do to him?" She was crying, her hands hovering over Torres, afraid to move him, her nursing training telling her not to adjust someone with spinal injuries. "Ma'am, step back or you'll be arrested too." Castellanos' camera recorded his own hand, reaching toward Carmen in a warning gesture. "He's paralyzed!" Carmen's voice was raw with fury and fear. "He has a spinal cord injury. You just assaulted a disabled veteran." The teenage employee was still recording, his phone capturing the scene from another angle as his livestream viewer count climbed past 2,000. The elderly man had already called 911, his shaky voice reporting an officer assaulting a man in a wheelchair. Other shoppers had their phones out now, creating a circle of witnesses documenting everything from multiple perspectives, while Castellanos' own body camera continued recording from his chest. But Castellano wasn't stopping. His camera showed him leaning down over Torres, pulling out his handcuffs. Torres's arms were yanked behind his back with enough force to make him cry out, and within seconds, the metal cuffs clicked tight around his wrists. The sound was captured perfectly on the body camera audio. Castellano was breathing hard, his face flushed, and he keyed his radio, calling for backup, and reporting that he had a suspect in custody who had resisted arrest. The lies were being broadcast over official police channels before Torres could even process what was happening, all while Castellanos' body camera recorded the truth. 2 more patrol cars arrived within 4 minutes, their body cameras activating as officers Jennifer Walsh and David Chen stepped out of their vehicles. Walsh's camera captured the scene, Torres handcuffed on the ground next to an overturned wheelchair, Carmen sobbing beside him, a crowd of angry witnesses with phones recording everything. "Ryan, what the hell happened here?" Walsh's voice carried clear concern, her 7 years of experience telling her immediately that something was very wrong. Castellano launched into his version of events, his body camera recording his own fabrication. Subject was loitering, refused to comply with orders to move along, claimed to be disabled, but I suspected he was faking. When I attempted to verify, he became combative, and I had to use necessary force to secure the scene. Chen walked over to Torres and crouched down, his body camera capturing a close view of Torres's face, the pain evident, the humiliation visible. "Sir, can you move your legs at all?" Torres's voice was strained, speaking through gritted teeth. "No, officer, I can't. I haven't been able to move my legs since 2007. I was injured in Iraq. I've been trying to tell Officer Castellano that I'm paralyzed from combat injuries." Chen's camera recorded him looking at Torres's legs, positioned at unnatural angles that no person with working muscles would find comfortable. He saw the torn catheter bag, the medical equipment, the VA hospital bracelet still visible on Torres's wrist. He stood slowly, his camera panning up to capture Castellano's face. "Ryan, he's really paralyzed." Chen's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "This man is actually disabled." Walsh had already picked up Torres's phone from where it had skidded across the parking lot. Her camera captured the screen, still showing Torres's text conversation with his wife about what groceries to buy, time-stamped from before Castellano had even arrived. She walked over to Castellano and showed him the phone. "Ryan, look at this. He was literally just sitting here texting his wife while she shopped. There's no loitering, there's no disturbance. There's nothing." But Castellano had already committed himself too far down this path to turn back. His camera recorded his defensive posture, his crossed arms. He refused a lawful order. He was in a location where he'd been asked to leave. I had probable cause to believe he was faking his disability to avoid compliance. Carmen stood up, her camera phone still recording, her voice cutting through with legal precision. "Officer, my husband is a decorated combat veteran with documented permanent paralysis. You assaulted him without probable cause, you arrested him without reasonable suspicion of any crime, and you did it because you made assumptions about him based on how he looks. This is a civil rights violation, and I have it recorded from multiple angles." Walsh made a decision. Against Castellano's protests, she and Chen carefully helped Torres off the ground, both officers genuinely apologetic as they lifted him back into his wheelchair after setting it upright. Torres's shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the pavement. His wrists had deep red marks from the handcuffs. His hands were scraped and bleeding from trying to break his fall, even though his paralyzed body couldn't brace properly. Chen uncuffed him, while Walsh retrieved his scattered belongings and called for an ambulance to check Torres for injuries. Castellano stood off to the side, his jaw clenched tight, his body camera still recording as he insisted he'd done everything by the book, and that this was a lawful arrest of a suspect who'd resisted. But the damage was already done in ways Castellano couldn't yet understand. What Officer Ryan Castellano didn't know was that his body camera footage would be subpoenaed within 72 hours. He didn't know that Internal Affairs would find those 19 buried complaints spanning 7 years, each one describing the same aggressive pattern toward minorities that his own equipment had just documented in perfect clarity. He didn't know that federal investigators were already being contacted by civil rights organizations who'd seen the viral videos, and he certainly didn't know that Michael Torres's attorney would use Castellano's own body camera recording as the primary evidence in a lawsuit that would expose systematic discrimination and cost Riverside $19.6 million. The body camera kept recording as paramedics arrived, as they examined Torres's injuries, as witnesses gave statements describing what they had observed. Every second was preserved in high-definition video, with crystal-clear audio captured by the very device meant to protect Castellano from false accusations. Sometimes the evidence that destroys a career comes from the officer's own equipment, documenting the truth they tried to deny. The video of Michael Torres being dragged from his wheelchair went viral within 6 hours, hitting local news by evening and national coverage by the next morning. The Riverside Police Department's phone lines were completely overwhelmed with calls demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding justice for a paralyzed veteran who'd been treated like a criminal for the offense of waiting in a parking lot while Latino. Chief of Police Margaret Sullivan watched Castellano's body camera footage in her office 9 times, and each viewing made her physically ill because she recognized exactly what she was looking at. Not just a bad arrest, but a civil rights violation so blatant and so thoroughly documented that there would be no way to minimize it or make it disappear quietly. She immediately ordered an internal affairs investigation and placed Officer Ryan Castellano on administrative leave. But she knew those actions were just the beginning of something much bigger and much worse for everyone involved. What Chief Sullivan didn't know yet, but was about to discover, was that Ryan Castellano had been a problem officer for nearly his entire career, and the department had been covering it up for years through a combination of willful blindness and institutional protection. The internal affairs investigation was assigned to Captain James Foster, a 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of problem officers but had never seen a file quite like Castellanos. When Foster pulled the complete personnel record and started reading through it with fresh eyes in the context of what had just happened to Michael Torres, he realized he was looking at a pattern of behavior that should have gotten Castellano fired at least 5 times over. The first complaint came just 11 months into Castellano's career, back in 2016, when a black man accused him of using excessive force during a traffic stop and making racist comments about gang affiliation. Despite the man being a high school math teacher with no criminal record, the complaint was investigated. Castellano denied everything. There was no video evidence because body cameras hadn't been implemented yet, and the case was closed as unsubstantiated after Castellano received a verbal warning about professional conduct. The complaints kept coming after that with disturbing regularity. In 2017, an elderly Latina woman accused Castellano of being aggressive and intimidating when he responded to her home for a welfare check called in by her daughter. In 2018, a young black man claimed Castellano had searched his vehicle without probable cause and threatened to plant drugs if he didn't cooperate. In 2019, 2 separate incidents resulted in excessive force complaints after traffic stops that Castellano claimed required physical intervention to secure combative subjects. Every single time, the internal investigations followed the same pattern. Castellano would deny wrongdoing, claim the complainants were lying or exaggerating, and the cases would be closed with minor disciplinary actions like retraining or short suspensions that never appeared on his public record. His fellow officers knew he had a reputation for being rough, and some of them had quietly requested not to be partnered with him. But those requests were documented only in informal conversations that left no paper trail. Captain Foster sat in Chief Sullivan's office 4 days after the Torres incident and laid out everything he'd found in a thick folder that represented 7 years of ignored red flags. "Chief, we have 19 formal complaints against Castellano spanning his entire career." Foster's voice was grim as he opened the file. 17 of those complaints came from people of color. 15 involved accusations of excessive force or racial bias. And we never connected the dots because each complaint was investigated in isolation and closed without looking at the bigger pattern. Sullivan's face went pale as Foster continued, laying out additional findings that made the situation even worse. There's more. In 2020, Castellano was involved in an arrest that resulted in a broken collarbone, and the victim settled with the city for $67,000. That settlement included a non-disclosure agreement, so it never became public. In 2021, he was accused of using a chokehold during an arrest, which violates department policy. But the investigation concluded there wasn't enough evidence to sustain the allegation, even though the suspect had bruising on his neck that matched hand grip patterns. The room was silent except for the sound of Foster turning pages in the file, each one representing another missed opportunity to stop Castellano before he assaulted a disabled veteran in a grocery store parking lot. "We had multiple opportunities to intervene," Foster said quietly, "to recognize the pattern, to remove him from street duty permanently. Instead, we gave him sensitivity training and sent him back out with a gun and a badge. And now, his own body camera has documented exactly what all those complainants were telling us for 7 years. Chief Sullivan knew exactly what this meant. The department hadn't just failed to stop one bad officer. They'd enabled him for years through a broken accountability system that treated each incident in isolation rather than recognizing the obvious pattern. The legal exposure was catastrophic. The moral failure was even worse. But the revelations kept coming, each one worse than the last. The civil rights attorney who took on Michael Torres as a client was Elena Martinez, a veteran lawyer with the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund who'd been waiting for a case like this, one with such clear evidence that it could force systemic change. Within 48 hours of being retained, Martinez filed a notice of claim against the city, the legal step required before filing a federal lawsuit. Her office started, conducting their own investigation, and what they uncovered made the internal affairs findings look incomplete. Martinez's investigators found 8 additional people who'd had negative encounters with Castellano, but never filed formal complaints because they didn't think anyone would believe them or didn't know how to navigate the complaint process. One of them was another disabled veteran, a white man with a prosthetic leg, who said Castellano had accused him of faking his disability during a traffic stop in 2019 and had made him walk a straight line to prove his prosthetic was real. Another was a black teenager who said Castellano had stopped him for looking suspicious while he was walking home from school in his own neighborhood wearing his school uniform. Martinez went further, pulling every arrest Castellano had made over the past 5 years using public records requests. Out of 312 arrests, 267 involved people of color, despite the district he patrolled being only 48% non-white. According to census data, 23 of those arrests were later dismissed by prosecutors due to lack of evidence or procedural problems. 11 resulted in complaints to the district attorney's office about Castellano's conduct. The statistical analysis was damning and would become a centerpiece of the federal case. Ryan Castellano wasn't just a bad officer having a bad day when he met Michael Torres. He was an officer with a clear, documented pattern of racial bias and excessive force that had been enabled by a department that didn't want to see what was right in front of them. The body camera footage that Castellano himself had recorded would become the irrefutable proof that the pattern was real, that the complaints had been legitimate, and that the department's failure to act had led directly to a disabled veteran being assaulted in broad daylight. The medical evaluation of Michael Torres after the incident revealed injuries that went far beyond the visible scrapes and bruises from hitting the parking lot pavement. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician who examined him at Riverside Memorial Hospital, documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood these records would be critical evidence. Torres had suffered a grade 2 rotator cuff strain in his right shoulder from the impact, an injury that would require months of physical therapy and might never fully heal. His wrists showed deep contusions and minor nerve damage from the handcuffs being applied with excessive force to a man who couldn't physically resist. The fall had aggravated his existing spinal injuries, causing inflammation that increased his chronic pain levels significantly. But the physical injuries were only part of the damage. Dr. Patricia Vance, the psychologist Torres began seeing 2 weeks after the assault, diagnosed him with acute post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically triggered by the parking lot incident. Torres, who had already lived with PTSD from his combat experiences, now had a new trauma layered on top of the old one, this time inflicted by an American police officer rather than enemy combatants. He couldn't sleep without seeing Castellano's face above him, couldn't go to grocery stores without having panic attacks, couldn't see police officers without his heart racing and his hands shaking. The man who had survived 3 tours in Iraq and earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor was now afraid to sit in parking lots in his own hometown. The VA doctors who had treated Torres for years wrote detailed reports explaining that forcing a paralyzed person from their wheelchair onto concrete wasn't just cruel, it was medically dangerous and could have resulted in additional permanent injuries including head trauma, fractures, or worsening of his spinal condition. Their documentation would become powerful, evidence that Castellano's actions went beyond excessive force into the realm of reckless endangerment of a vulnerable person. While Torres struggled with the aftermath, the investigation was expanding in ways that would expose the full scope of the department's failures. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division received a formal complaint from the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund within 1 week of the incident. Federal investigators arrived in Riverside faster than anyone expected, not just to examine the Torres case, but to investigate the entire pattern of complaints against Castellano and the department's response to those complaints. They interviewed witnesses from the parking lot, each one describing the same thing: a peaceful man in a wheelchair being confronted without provocation, refusing to be intimidated despite clear fear, being physically assaulted while helpless, and then arrested for the crime of asserting his rights. The consistency of the witness statements, combined with Castellano's own body camera footage, made the case ironclad. The investigators reviewed body camera footage from other incidents where Castellano had been accused of misconduct. The The department had implemented body cameras in 2019, meaning the most recent 4 years of Castellano's career were documented. What they found was revealing. In 17 separate incidents captured on body camera, Castellano could be seen making assumptions about people of color that he never made about white citizens in similar situations. A Latino man stopped for a broken taillight was asked about immigration status despite having a valid California driver's license. A black woman questioned at a traffic accident was asked if the car was really hers, despite being listed as the registered owner. An Asian teenager skateboarding was questioned about gang affiliation, despite wearing a private school uniform. The pattern was undeniable when reviewed systematically, rather than investigated incident by incident. Castellano operated with implicit bias that manifested in different treatment of minorities, and his own body camera had been documenting it for years. But the most damning evidence came from comparing Castellano's body camera footage to the footage of other officers in similar situations. When Officer Jennifer Walsh encountered a man in a wheelchair during a welfare check, her body camera showed her asking respectfully about his needs, offering assistance and accepting his explanation without demanding proof. When Officer David Chen responded to a call about someone sitting in a parking lot, his footage showed him politely asking if everything was okay, and leaving when told the person was just waiting for someone. The difference in how Castellano treated people, especially disabled people of color, versus how other officers handled identical situations, became powerful evidence of discriminatory policing. His own body camera footage meant to protect him, instead documented his bias in ways that witness testimony alone never could. Elena Martinez and her legal team at MildDF built a comprehensive case using multiple sources of evidence. Castellano's body camera footage from the Torres incident provided the foundation, an unedited first-person perspective of the entire encounter from initial contact through the assault. Carmen Torres' cell phone video provided a second angle, showing Castellano's aggressive body language and Michael's terrified response. The teenage employee's livestream captured the crowd's reaction and the aftermath. But Martinez also obtained the surveillance footage from Morrison's Market. The store's security cameras, mounted at the entrance and in the parking lot, had captured the entire incident from fixed positions with timestamps. This footage showed that Torres had been sitting peacefully for 11 minutes before Castellano arrived, never causing any disturbance, just waiting exactly as he'd said. The grocery store's manager provided a sworn statement that no one from the store had called police or complained about Torres. The call that brought Castellano to the parking lot had been anonymous, routed through the non-emergency line, with no specific complaint other than a man in a wheelchair looking suspicious. The dispatcher's recording of that call would become evidence of racial profiling, someone seeing a Latino man in a wheelchair and deciding he didn't belong. Martinez deposed Castellano 6 months after the incident, and the deposition transcript would become a masterclass in how prejudice operates even when people claim colorblindness. Asked why he approached Torres, Castellano said he looked out of place. Asked what made Torres look out of place, Castellano couldn't articulate a specific reason. Asked if he would have approached a white man in a wheelchair sitting in the same location, Castellano hesitated, then claimed he would have, but the pattern of his arrests and his body camera footage proved otherwise. The evidence was overwhelming, documented from multiple angles, preserved in multiple formats, and impossible to deny. Ryan Castellano's own body camera had recorded the truth, and that truth was about to cost him everything and force Riverside to reckon with years of enabled discrimination. 11 months after Michael Torres was dragged from his wheelchair in a grocery store parking lot, the consequences came down like a hammer on everyone involved, starting with Officer Ryan Castellano himself. The Riverside Police Department fired Castellano after the internal affairs investigation concluded he had violated multiple department policies, including excessive use of force, failure to de-escalate, discriminatory policing, unlawful arrest, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The termination letter, which became public record through the lawsuit, cited not just the Torres incident, but the entire pattern of complaints that had been ignored for too long. Castellano appealed the decision through his union, claiming he'd been made a scapegoat for systemic problems and that he'd acted within his training and authority. but the appeal was denied after the union representatives saw the full scope of evidence against him, including his own body camera footage that had been watched tens of millions of times online and made Riverside a national symbol of police misconduct. But losing his job wasn't the end of Castellanos' problems. The district attorney's office, under intense public pressure and after reviewing the overwhelming evidence, filed criminal charges against him for battery under color of authority and assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury. These were rare charges against a police officer for on-duty conduct, marking how egregious the Torres assault had been. Castellano pled not guilty and hired a defense attorney who argued his client had made a judgment call in a tense situation, had no way of knowing Torres was legitimately disabled and never intended to cause serious harm. The criminal case worked through the system slowly, but legal experts noted that the body camera, evidence, and witness testimony made Castellanos' defense extremely difficult. If convicted on both charges, he faced up to 5 years in state prison and would never work in law enforcement again. His trial date was set for 14 months after the incident, giving him plenty of time to understand how thoroughly his own body camera had documented his downfall. The civil lawsuit hit even harder and moved much faster. Elena Martinez filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Central District of California on behalf of Michael Torres. The complaint named Officer Ryan Castellano personally, the city of Riverside, and Police Chief Margaret Sullivan in her official capacity. The lawsuit alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable seizure, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, the Americans with Disabilities Act, California's Unruh Civil Rights Act, battery, assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent supervision and training. The lawsuit demanded $19.6 million in damages, a figure calculated based on Torres's physical injuries, his psychological trauma, his lost income from being unable to continue his work as a peer counselor at the VA, his wife's lost wages from taking leave to care for him, and punitive damages designed to punish the city for its deliberate indifference to Castellanos' pattern of misconduct despite years of warning signs. The city's attorneys initially suggested they might fight the case, believing they could argue qualified immunity for Castellano and lack of municipal liability. But after the first round of depositions began and the full scope of the department's failures became clear in sworn testimony, the city's legal position collapsed. Captain Foster's deposition was particularly devastating. Under oath, he described finding 19 complaints against Castellano that had been investigated in isolation, without anyone connecting the obvious pattern. He described the broken accountability system that treated each incident as a one-off rather than recognizing systematic bias. He described supervisors who had defended Castellano as aggressive but effective without questioning whether his effectiveness came at the cost of civil rights violations. Chief Sullivan's deposition was worse. She was forced to admit that the department had paid out settlements in 3 previous cases involving Castellano, each with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the pattern from becoming public. She had to acknowledge that multiple officers had requested not to work with Castellano because of his aggressive approach to minorities, but these requests had never triggered any formal review. She had to sit there while Martinez played Castellanos body camera footage and explain why the department had allowed an officer with this clear bias to continue patrolling for 7 years. The city council received a litigation risk assessment from their attorneys that was blunt and terrifying. The body camera evidence was unassailable. The pattern of ignored complaints was documented in the department's own files. The testimony from department leadership showed awareness of problems without meaningful action. Multiple witnesses, multiple videos, medical documentation, statistical analysis of discriminatory enforcement, all of it pointed to one conclusion. If this case went to trial, the jury verdict could exceed the demanded amount by millions, potentially tens of millions. 3 months before trial was scheduled to begin, the Riverside City Council voted in a closed session to authorize settlement negotiations. The vote was unanimous, driven by the recognition that fighting this case was not only legally unwinnable but morally indefensible. The settlement negotiations were handled by a mediator, a retired federal judge who reviewed all the evidence and met separately with both sides. After 2 full days of mediation, A settlement was reached. The city of Riverside would pay Michael Torres $19.6 million, one of the largest civil rights settlements in California history for a single incident. But the settlement included more than just money. The city agreed to a consent decree requiring sweeping reforms to prevent future incidents of discriminatory policing and violence against people with disabilities. These reforms, monitored by an independent compliance officer for 5 years, included mandatory implicit bias training for all officers with quarterly testing, an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of complaints before they escalated to civil rights violations, a civilian review board with real authority to investigate misconduct and recommend discipline, specific training on interacting with people with disabilities, body camera footage review, protocols for all use of force incidents, and demographic data collection on all stops, searches, and arrests with public quarterly reporting. The city also agreed to contact and offer compensation to the 8 other victims of Castellanos' misconduct that Martinez's investigation had identified, paying out an additional $840,000 in combined settlements to avoid further litigation and provide some measure of justice to people whose complaints had been dismissed years earlier. When the settlement was announced at a press conference, Michael Torres sat in his wheelchair at the podium, flanked by his wife Carmen and his attorney Elena Martinez, and spoke to a room packed with media from around the country. Michael Torres's voice was steady when he spoke to the assembled media, but the weight of what he'd endured was visible in every word, in the way his hands gripped his wheelchair armrests, in the way Carmen stood close beside him with her hand on his shoulder. $19.6 million doesn't undo what happened to me in that parking lot. It doesn't erase the humiliation of being dragged from my wheelchair and thrown onto concrete like garbage. It doesn't take away the nightmares or the fear I still feel when I see a police officer. But what it does do is send a message that there are consequences when law enforcement treats people with disabilities, treats people of color, as less than human. He paused, taking a breath, and continued with words that would be quoted in news coverage for weeks. I served 3 tours in Iraq. I took shrapnel defending this country. I came home paralyzed but proud of my service. And Officer Ryan Castellano looked at me, saw a Latino man in a wheelchair, and decided I was lying about my disability, decided I didn't belong in a public parking lot, decided I deserved to be assaulted for refusing his unlawful orders. That wasn't about me being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was about him seeing someone he deemed suspicious based on prejudice, and his own body camera proved it. The settlement made national headlines and sparked conversations about police accountability, discrimination against people with disabilities, and the role of body cameras in documenting civil rights violations. The footage of Torres being assaulted, captured from Castellanos' own perspective, was played in news segments and became required viewing in police academies as an example of exactly what not to do. But the impact went beyond the immediate case. The consent decree forced the Riverside Police Department to implement reforms that would fundamentally change how they operated, how they trained officers, and how they responded to complaints. Chief Margaret Sullivan, who had initially defended the department's complaint investigation process, announced her retirement 6 months after the settlement was finalized. In her resignation statement, she acknowledged that the department had failed to protect the community from an officer whose bias was evident in complaint after complaint, and that this failure had led directly to Michael Torres being assaulted. 3 supervisors who had signed off on closing Castellanos' previous complaints without proper investigation were demoted. The entire Internal Affairs Division was restructured with new leadership and new protocols requiring pattern analysis of complaints rather than isolated investigation of individual incidents. The Riverside Police Department hired Dr. James Wilson, a leading expert on implicit bias in policing, to develop and implement a comprehensive training program. Every officer was required to complete 40 hours of training on recognizing and counteracting implicit bias, interacting respectfully with people with disabilities, de-escalation techniques, and constitutional policing. Officers who failed the quarterly assessments were removed from street duty until they could demonstrate proficiency. The Civilian Review Board, composed of community members including disability rights advocates, civil rights attorneys, and residents from neighborhoods that had historically been over-policed, was given real authority to investigate complaints, access body camera footage, and recommend discipline up to and including termination. Within its first year of operation, the board reviewed 127 complaints and recommended discipline in 34 cases, a dramatic increase from the previous system where most complaints were dismissed. The body camera program was expanded and strengthened. All officers were required to activate cameras for every citizen interaction without exception. Failure to activate cameras resulted in immediate suspension. All body camera footage from incidents involving use of force, complaints, or arrests was reviewed by both supervisors and the Civilian Review Board. The department also implemented a policy requiring officers to inform citizens that they were being recorded, reducing the adversarial dynamic that had characterized so many of Castellanos' interactions. Michael Torres used a portion of his settlement to establish the Torres Foundation for Disability Rights and Police Accountability, a non-profit organization providing free legal representation to people with disabilities who experience discrimination or abuse by law enforcement. The foundation, run by Carmen Torres as executive director with Michael as board chair, handled 43 cases in its first 2 years, securing settlements and policy changes in multiple jurisdictions. Torres also became a powerful advocate for reform, testifying before the California State Legislature about the need for stronger protections for people with disabilities in interactions with law enforcement. His testimony, delivered from his wheelchair with the same dignity he'd maintained in that parking lot, helped pass Assembly Bill 265-8, which required all California law enforcement agencies to implement disability awareness training and establish stricter standards for use of force against people with disabilities. The teenage employee whose live stream had captured the assault from a different angle received a commendation from the Civilian Review Board for documenting civil rights violations and providing crucial evidence. His video, combined with Castellanos' body camera footage and Carmen's recording, had created an irrefutable record that made justice possible. Officer Ryan Castellanos' criminal trial took place 18 months after he dragged Michael Torres from his wheelchair. The prosecution presented the body camera footage on the trial's first day, and the impact on the jury was immediate. Castellano was convicted on both counts of battery under color of authority and assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury. At sentencing, the judge noted that Castellano had shown no remorse, had never apologized to Torres, and had continued to insist that he'd done nothing wrong despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The judge sentenced Castellano to 4 years in state prison, stating that officers who abuse their authority and violate the rights of vulnerable people deserve punishment that reflects the severity of their betrayal of public trust. The case became a landmark in several areas of law. It was cited in federal court decisions about body camera evidence and its role in civil rights litigation. It was taught in law schools as an example of how systematic documentation of discriminatory patterns can overcome qualified immunity defenses. It was referenced in disability rights advocacy as proof that people with disabilities deserve full protection under civil rights laws. 5 years after the settlement, an independent compliance monitor issued a report finding that the Riverside Police Department had successfully implemented all required reforms and had shown measurable improvement in community relations, reduction in use of force incidents, and equitable enforcement across demographic groups. Complaints alleging racial bias or discrimination against people with disabilities had dropped by 68%. The department had become a model for how to implement meaningful accountability. Michael Torres continued his advocacy work, speaking at universities, police academies, and community forums about his experience and the importance of holding law enforcement accountable, while also supporting officers who serve with integrity and respect for civil rights. He and Carmen raised their 2 children, both now teenagers, teaching them about dignity, justice, and the power of standing up for your rights, even when it's frightening. The wheelchair Michael Torres had been sitting in when Officer Castellano assaulted him was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History as part of an exhibit on disability rights and civil rights in the 21st century. It sits there now, a silent witness to one man's courage and to the system's eventual reckoning with its own failures. Officer Ryan Castellano served his sentence and was released after 3 years. He is prohibited from ever working in law enforcement again. He never apologized to Michael Torres, He never acknowledged that his own body camera had captured the truth about his bias and his violence, but the truth didn't need his acknowledgement. It was preserved in high-definition video, captured by his own equipment, watched by millions, presented in court, and vindicated by a $19.6 million settlement that proved Michael Torres had been right all along. Sometimes justice comes slowly. Sometimes it takes viral videos, federal investigations, criminal prosecution, and the largest civil rights settlement in a city's history. Sometimes it requires one man's courage to assert his rights while lying helpless on parking lot asphalt, his dignity intact even when his body had been thrown to the ground. But when justice finally arrives, when the system is forced to confront its failures and implement real change, when accountability becomes more than just a word in a policy manual, it matters. It matters to Michael Torres, to the 8 other victims who received settlements, to the countless people who will never be assaulted by Officer Castellano because he's in prison and will never wear a badge again, and to every person with a disability who deserves to exist in public spaces without being questioned, doubted, or attacked. The body camera that Officer Ryan Castellano activated that Sunday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot was meant to protect him. Instead, it documented his downfall and proved that sometimes the truth, recorded in perfect clarity from the perpetrator's own perspective, is the most powerful evidence of all. If you believe that officers who assault people with disabilities deserve prison time, that body cameras must be tools of accountability rather than protection for misconduct. And that civil rights settlements should force real systemic change, share this story. Because the fight for justice continues, and every case that holds power accountable makes the next fight a little bit easier.